In the year 1400, in the kitchen of a stone manor house in Suffolk, a woman named Dame Alice de Brian sat at a table with a ledger open before her. She was not writing poetry. She was not composing prayers. She was counting barrels of ale. Her household accounts, which survive to this day, record the brewing cycles and provisions for everyone under her roof: family, servants, guests, laborers passing through at harvest. Ale appears on nearly every page. Not wine, not water. Ale. Brewed on the premises, consumed the same week, brewed again. Over and over, month after month, the rhythm of her household turning on grain and water and yeast the way a clock turns on gears. You have probably heard the claim. Medieval people never drank water. The water was poisonous, the story goes, so everyone, men, women, even small children, drank beer all day long. It is one of those facts that circulates on the internet with the confident energy of something that sounds too strange to be invented. And like most things that sound too strange to be invented, it is not quite true. But the reality underneath it is stranger and more interesting than the myth. Because while medieval Europeans did drink water, more on that later, the sheer scale of ale and beer in daily life across Northern Europe is something the modern mind genuinely struggles to absorb. This is a story about bread you could drink, about women who built an industry and were pushed out of it, about monks who ran what amounted to small factories, about a chemical process that saved lives centuries before anyone understood why, and about a world where the line between food and beverage did not exist in any way you would recognize. Start with the numbers. The Westminster Abbey accounts from the 14th and 15th centuries, studied in meticulous detail by the historian Barbara Harvey, record that each monk received a daily allocation of roughly 1 gallon of ale, 4.5 liters, every day. Before you picture brothers stumbling through Vespers, understand what that gallon contained. This was not the golden, carbonated lager sitting in your refrigerator. Medieval ale was cloudy, brownish, often slightly sour, brewed without hops, and weak, somewhere between 1% and 3% alcohol by volume. Thinner than most modern light beers, it spoiled in days. It was brewed constantly because it had to be. And that gallon was not a quirk of monastic indulgence. It was institutional planning. Ale provided hydration in a world without municipal plumbing. It provided calories in a world where caloric scarcity was the background condition of most lives. And it did not spoil the way a bucket of water drawn from a well near a latrine would spoil. The monks at Westminster were not unusual. They were documented. Consider the plan of St. Gall, a 9th century architectural drawing that lays out the ideal Carolingian monastery in extraordinary detail. Among the cloisters and the infirmary and the scriptorium, the plan includes 3 separate brewhouses, one for the monks themselves, one for pilgrims and guests, one for the poor who came to the abbey gate. 3 tiers of brewing, built into the institutional blueprint like plumbing into a modern hospital. Brewing was not a sideline. It was infrastructure, as essential as the chapel. Now, step outside the monastery walls. Walk into a medieval English village, say a market town in the Midlands, sometime in the 13th century. You would notice, if you knew what to look for, a peculiar sight repeated on several streets. A long pole projecting from a doorway with a bundle of evergreen branches tied to the end. No sign, no lettering, just the bush. That bush meant ale was for sale, and the person selling it was almost certainly a woman. For roughly 3 centuries, from the Norman conquest through the 1300s, brewing in England was overwhelmingly women's work. The historian Judith Bennett documented this in painstaking detail, compiling hundreds of entries from manorial court rolls, the bureaucratic records of local justice that medieval England generated in astonishing volume. The women who brewed were called alewives. They worked from home. They malted their own grain, heated the mash over their own hearth, and when a batch was ready, they hung the ale stake from their door. Neighbors came, bought a jug, went home. This was not a casual arrangement. It was regulated by the Assize of Bread and Ale, established in 1267 under Henry III, which set prices and quality standards and imposed fines on anyone who violated them. And here is where the court rolls become fascinating. Bennett found women appearing in these records over and over, fined year after year for the same infractions. Overcharging, using short measures, selling ale that did not meet the standard. The fines were small. The women paid them and kept brewing. The system functioned less like criminal justice and more like a licensing fee. The authorities knew it. The alewives knew it. Everyone understood the arrangement. The parchment recorded it all. You could argue that these women ran the most essential food service industry in medieval England, operating from their kitchens with no capital beyond a kettle and a sack of grain. And for a long time, no one tried to stop them. Then hops arrived. Hops came to England from the Low Countries, primarily in the 15th century, and they changed everything. Not just the flavor, though they did that, transforming the sweet, perishable ale into the more bitter, more stable drink we would begin to recognize as beer. The critical change was preservation. Hops acted as a natural antimicrobial, extending shelf life from days to weeks, even months. And that extension of shelf life meant you could brew in larger batches, ship barrels over longer distances, invest in bigger equipment, build a business that operated at commercial scale. Scale required capital. Capital required guild membership. And the guilds, in most English towns, were controlled by men. Hops did not just change the taste of English beer. They changed who was allowed to make it. Over the course of the 15th and 16th centuries, the alewife, working from her door with her ale stake and her small batches, was gradually displaced by the commercial brewer, operating from a dedicated brewhouse with copper kettles and hired labor. One of the best documented cases of gendered economic displacement in medieval history, and it happened not through any single decree, but through the quiet accumulation of capital, technology, and institutional exclusion. If you had told a 13th century alewife that her granddaughter's granddaughter would not be permitted to brew for sale, she would not have believed you. She was the brewer. Everyone knew that. Now, the question you have been waiting for. The children. This is the claim that stops people mid-scroll, and it requires honesty. Direct evidence of what specific toddlers drank at specific ages in the medieval period is sparse. The historian Nicholas Orme, who wrote the most comprehensive study of medieval childhood, documents that children were integrated into the household economy and diet from a young age. But no surviving medieval source describes, in so many words, a 3-year-old being handed a cup of ale. What we can say is this. In a household where ale was the staple daily beverage, where it was brewed on the premises and served at every meal, there was no separate category of children's drink. There was no juice box. There was no filtered tap water. There was what the household drank, and what the household drank was ale. The weakest runnings from the mash, called small beer, could fall below 1% alcohol, less than a ripe banana produces through natural fermentation. At that strength, the intoxicating effect on even a small child would have been negligible. Hospital records confirm that patients in institutions like St. Bartholomew's in London received ale as part of their care. Ale was nourishment. It was what you gave someone who needed feeding and hydrating. The scandal a modern viewer feels at the thought of a child drinking beer is real, but it belongs to our world, not theirs. In theirs, it was ordinary, unremarkable, as invisible as the bread on the table. Here is where the story turns from social history to chemistry, and where the most important revelation hides. You have heard that medieval beer was safer than water. That much is partly true. But the reason is not what most people think. At 1 to 2% alcohol, small beer did not contain nearly enough ethanol to kill bacteria on its own. A modern microbiologist would tell you that you need concentrations far above that to achieve meaningful sterilization. The alcohol was not the hero of this story. The boiling was. The brewing process required heating the water and grain mixture to temperatures that killed virtually every waterborne pathogen. The bacteria that caused dysentery, the parasites that bred in stagnant urban water, the invisible dangers that medieval people could not name but had learned, through hard and repeated experience, to fear. After boiling, the fermentation process lowered the pH and introduced competitive yeasts that made the liquid even more hostile to harmful organisms. After hops became common, their antimicrobial compounds added another layer. The result was a beverage that was not sterilized in the modern sense, but was far, far safer than untreated water drawn from a city well 10 yards from a cesspit. Medieval brewers were doing something remarkable. They had invented, through centuries of empirical practice, a process that achieved what Louis Pasteur would not explain for another 600 years. They did not know why it worked. They knew that it worked. And they kept doing it, batch after batch, week after week, across the lifetimes of millions of people who never got sick from what they drank. But here is what makes the process truly ingenious in the context of a subsistence economy. Boiling water alone would have achieved the same pathogen reduction. Medieval medical texts occasionally recommended it for the sick, but boiled water gives you nothing except clean water. It provides no calories. It cannot be stored. Within hours, recontamination begins. It does not nourish a laborer hauling stone or a pregnant woman or a child who needs every calorie the household can spare. Ale did all of it. Hydration, calories, preservation, safety in a single vessel. In a world without refrigeration, without plumbing, without germ theory, that efficiency was not trivial. It was the difference between a food system that worked and one that did not. And now we arrive at the part that might surprise you most. Medieval people drank water. The viral claim, the one that brought you here perhaps, that nobody in the Middle Ages touched the stuff, is itself a modern myth. The food historian Jim Chevalier spent years compiling evidence from medieval sources that systematically demolishes the absolute version of this claim. People drank water. They drank it regularly. They knew which sources were safe and which were not. A spring on a hillside, a well sunk into chalk or limestone, a fast-moving river upstream of any settlement, these were recognized as clean. Stagnant water near a tannery or a dye works or a slaughterhouse was recognized as dangerous, and medieval towns invested real resources in protecting their water. London built the Great Conduit in 1237, an engineered channel carrying fresh water from Tyburn Springs to Cheapside, maintained by the city and fiercely defended against contamination. Municipal records from the 13th and 14th centuries contain repeated ordinances punishing anyone who fouled public water sources. Fines were levied. Regulations were enforced. These were not people too ignorant to understand clean water. They were people managing a civic resource with the tools they had. The honest picture is more nuanced than the meme. Rural populations, and the majority of medieval Europeans were rural, often had access to perfectly good water and drank it alongside their ale. Urban populations faced a different calculation. As towns grew denser Between the 11th and 14th centuries, the distance between where waste was dumped and where water was drawn shrank. London's Fleet River, once clean enough to give its name to a respectable neighborhood, became an open sewer by the 1300s. In that context, in a thickening city where your well might sit 12 feet from your neighbor's latrine, ale was genuinely the safer choice. Not because all water was poison, because your water might be, and you had no way to test it. The distinction matters. Medieval people were not foolish. They were making rational decisions with incomplete information in an environment that was, in specific places and specific decades, genuinely threatening. The ale was not a sign of ignorance. It was a sign of intelligence operating without microscopes. If you are watching this and something in this story has surprised you, the alewives, the science, the water, I would like to hear which part. Leave it in the comments. This channel exists because these conversations matter, and the best ones happen when you bring what you know. Think about what we have covered. A gallon a day at Westminster Abbey. A woman hanging a bush from her door, selling what she brewed that morning, paying her fine and brewing again. 3 brewhouses in a single monastery blueprint. A boiling process that killed pathogens 6 centuries before Pasteur. A child at a trestle table drinking from a wooden cup, the liquid inside cloudy and faintly sour, and no one in the room thinking twice about it. A city building a stone conduit to carry clean water across a mile of crowded streets. And a slow economic revolution in which the women who built an industry watched it taken from them as it grew profitable. None of this is what you expected when you heard that medieval people drank beer instead of water. The truth, as it usually does with the Middle Ages, turned out to be less dramatic and more human than the legend. They were not helpless. They were not ignorant. They were people feeding families in a world that offered no safety nets, no preservatives, no refrigeration, and no clean water guarantees. And they engineered a solution from grain and fire and time that kept them alive. The next time you pass a brewery, a craft operation in a converted warehouse, a tap room with its name on a wooden sign above the door, notice the sign. It is not so different from a bush tied to a pole, projecting from a doorway on a 13th century English street. A signal that someone inside has turned grain into something worth buying. The technology has changed. The chemistry is the same. The woman who once stood in that doorway has been written out of the story for 600 years. She is in the court rolls, though. Fined again. Brewing again. Her name on parchment, in ink that has outlasted the ale, the house, and the world that made both necessary. If this is the kind of history that matters to you, specific, unsanitized, built from the records that survived, subscribe. The next episode goes deeper into a medieval world that keeps turning out to be stranger and smarter than anyone told you it was.